In his comprehensible input hypothesis, Stephen Krashen tells us that we need to adapt information to help ELLs understand it. There are a variety of ways that this can be done. Teachers can adapt their own speech and their own body language. Teachers can also adapt the materials. Teachers can adapt the classroom environment. There are many things in our control to help us make input comprehensible. First, teachers can make nonverbal and paraverbal adaptations. Teachers can enunciate the words, but they need to make sure that they do not distort the true pronunciation. For example, I've heard many novice ESL teachers say the number 20, when true standard American English pronounces the number 20. Teachers can also slow the rate of their speech, but they should keep it natural by pausing between major idea units. I'll use my next sentence as an example. Teachers should slow the rate of speech, but still use a variety of volumes and intonations to accentuate meaning, to avoid sounding monotone like a robot. Did you see how I said that sentence slower for ELLs to understand? But I didn't just chop it word by word by word. I kept the phrasing, I kept the subject, I kept the complete verb, prepositional phrases, adjectives and nouns were always together. That's what we need to do. And going back to that sentence, yes, teachers can fluctuate or use the variety of volumes and intonations to accentuate meanings. For example, if I want to talk about a big pizza, I can have my arms shoot up above my head, straight up, and come down on both sides, making the shape of a circle to show the idea of big, but then also use intonation, something like this: a big pizza. And vocalizations that we can use to express ideas, gestures, like I had mentioned before, pantomimes if we have to, facial expressions. Vocalization is an example like this when you are studying a word like pant. We know that there is a definition like pants, things that you wear, and ELLs would learn that first because that's part of BICS, it's part of survival English. But if we're talking about panting like a dog, you might need a vocalization. You might need to open your mouth, stick out your tongue, and pant like a dog. That helps them to understand. That provides comprehensible input. Believe me, ESL classes can sometimes get real crazy and comical, but it's definitely worth it when you see the students understanding. Teachers can also use something called scaffolding to make content comprehensible and to teach vocabulary. Scaffolding happens when a more proficient teacher, like a native English-speaking teacher, has a conversation with a less proficient speaker, like an ESL student. The teacher uses techniques like repeating phrases and sentences that the ELL produces, but says them correctly without the mistakes. The teacher also asks the student questions to keep the conversation going, not letting the conversation die out. Or another scaffolding technique is that the teacher supplies words so that the student keeps talking. In a separate file in our Angel Learning website, you can hear an example of a scaffolded conversation. At the beginning of the conversation, the adult repeats the most important part of the student's sentence, which is broken. This shows that she's listening to the student and understands what he's trying to say. It encourages the student to continue to talk. It appears that the ELL and the teacher have now agreed that they are talking about something that is broken. In fact, the student's next offering is considerably more complex. Broken, this is broken, broken. At this point, the adult finally understands what the beginning level ELL is attempting to communicate by broken and intervenes. By saying that it was broken, the ELL had been trying to say that there was something wrong with the object he was describing, but he didn't know the proper phrase or the proper word. Fortunately, the adult was able to infer what the student was trying to say and offered the correct phrase, upside down. Instead of being broken, the ELL really meant that the object was upside down. In his natural order hypothesis, Stephen Krashen tells us about the silent period. Using TPR and skilled questions techniques are perfect for students at the beginning proficiency level. TPR means total physical response, a technique by James Asher in the 1960s where students demonstrate comprehension in a nonverbal way. They move around instead of speak. Teachers can ask ELL questions that require a nonverbal response, a head movement, like a shaking, nodding their head yes or shaking their head no, pointing to something. They can manipulate materials and follow along the teacher's commands. They can demonstrate something. Here's an example for math class. If a teacher needs to teach the concept of more than, less than, equal to, he could command 3 boys to stand in a line and 2 girls to stand in a different line to show the difference between more than and less than. In the same math class, for the communicative property of addition, he could have 3 boys and 2 girls stand up in a line all grouped together, and then 2 boys and 3 girls in another line to show that the groups are equal even though they're composed of differing numbers. So 3 plus 2 equals 2 plus 3, in other words. In social studies class, an ELL could follow a latitude line with his finger on a globe when the teacher asked for a definition of latitude. These are all nonverbal ways that students at the beginning level can show that they understand and that they've learned a concept. Not only do we have to adapt teacher talk, but we also need to adapt materials. Here's a list of some contextual adaptations. Teachers can use visual aids, which are things like pictures, quick impromptu sketches that you make on a whiteboard, diagrams, models. Teachers can use auditory aids, which are recorded sound effects, recorded speech, media. Teachers can use props, realia, and manipulatives. Realia means that the object is real money. You bring in a real telephone for them to use. You bring in a real menu from a real restaurant. You bring in real sales sheets. Props are similar to realia, but they're not real. So instead of real money, you're giving them Monopoly money or plastic coins. Instead of using a real telephone, you're giving them a toy telephone to use. Manipulatives is anything that a student can use to get a job done. So for example, when they count M&Ms or buttons or marbles or popsicle sticks or beans, if they use blocks, tangrams, geoboards, algebra tiles, paper plates to cut them into fractions, any of those things would be manipulatives. Teachers can use equipment for hands-on learning, things like microscopes, calculators, any type of machine. And of course, hands-on learning, demonstrations, experiments, projects, role play, or simulation, where they're using all of these visual aids, auditory aids, props, reality, manipulatives, and equipment. We tie it all together, and using these things helps ELLs to comprehend our input. All right, take what you've learned from Krashen about the natural order and be aware of what grammar your ELLs know right now and what they're ready to learn according to the natural order. Although it is a lot of work, some teachers will change a text by simplifying its grammatical structures. This needs to be done with care because you don't want to oversimplify to the point of not teaching ELLs the same scope and sequence that native speakers are getting. That's, remember, what the Florida Consent Decree complaint was partly about. They want to have that same scope and sequence, so you can't oversimplify. The goal for us is to improve comprehensibility, not to water down the content. We want students to progress toward the ability to work with unmodified, authentic texts. If you want to do this for a particularly difficult section of text, you could break long sentences into a bunch of shorter ones, and you could change the passive verb tense into the active form. An example of the passive verb tense is, or I should say passive verb voice, is the tense were moved as the seasons change. So were moved is in the passive voice. The active voice, which is much easier for ELLs to understand, would include the subject that's doing the acting. So we would say the Mongols, the people of Mongolia, the Mongols move their tense when the seasons change. So we change the verb form from were moved to move. We put it in the active tense. You would also take out idioms and slang and prepare explanations for yourself for when students ask what transitional words and phrases, like what does therefore mean, what does nevertheless or otherwise. You have to understand that they're going to look up those words in the dictionary, and they might look up other under the O section, and then they look up wise under the W section, because they might know those two words when they're separate, and they can't figure out the definition when they put them together. Or never, the, less. I know what those three words mean, but when you push it together, what in the world does this mean? You're going to get questions like that. More manageable ways to adapt text than to rewrite everything include activating prior knowledge and experience at the beginning of every lesson. Teachers can present key vocabulary and concepts prior to starting the activity. They can provide an overview of the activity, a clear outline or plan for the day. They can design study guides or advanced organizers with focus questions or concept maps. All of this helps ELLs to understand the input. Teachers should use a variety of tasks. We always want to begin with a concrete hands-on activity and then move on to using the new material in abstract and language-only ways. For example, if you are teaching public speaking, ELLs could analyze a speech given by a president or by a motivational speaker first, and then after they have analyzed that, they have seen the model, then they can practice giving their own speeches. As always, keep in mind your students' individual learning styles and multiple intelligences. It is pretty clear that a teacher using CALA is working very hard to keep her ELL's needs and progress at the forefront of her mind. So it makes sense that she wants to get to know her students intimately in order to identify what makes them tick. Part of that is knowing a student's learning style. Learning style is the way in which a person thinks or learns. The three primary perceptual learning styles or ways of taking in information are visual learners, auditory learners, and tactile kinesthetic learners. The visual learner learns through seeing. This learner prepares to learn through written materials or visual materials. Pictorial descriptions, charts, graphs, and illustrations are important to use with the visual learner. Many teachers are visual learners and thus teach to this strength. That's an important fact we need to keep in mind. The auditory learner learns through listening. This person or this learner prefers to learn by discussion, making presentations, or through hearing information. Often tape recorders are a helpful tool for the auditory learner. The tactile kinesthetic learner learns by doing. This learner prefers to learn with a hands-on approach. Movement, music in the background, and activities are good teaching techniques for this type of learner. Other students may also develop learning styles that involve approaching new situations primarily through feeling or thinking. Imaginative learners integrate experience with the self. They seek personal involvement, commitment, and insight. They are interested in people and culture. They approach problems reflectively, and they look for meaning. They sometimes have trouble making decisions because They can see all sides. Analytic learners perceive information abstractly, developing theories from integrating their observations with what is known. They want continuity. They need to know what the experts think. They value sequential thinking and details. They are thorough and appreciate traditional classrooms. They are engrossed in ideas and are uncomfortable with subjective judgments. Common sense learners integrate theory and practice. They are pragmatic, believing if something works, use it. They do not tolerate fuzzy ideas or stand on ceremony. Get to the point is their motto. They like to tinker and experiment with things. Dynamic learners learn by trial and error, integrating experience and application. They like change, flexibility, and risk-taking. They get enthusiastic about new things. They can arrive at accurate conclusions in the absence of logic. They may seem pushy, but they are at ease with people. The differences in students' learning styles, whether ELL or not, can be so diverse that a single teaching style can exclude some students from learning in the classroom. So when writing activities or designing lessons, it's important to constantly stop and decide whether or not the lessons and activities exploit a wide range of learning styles, and then modify your lesson plans if they don't. Learning styles are very different from culture to culture. Being aware that there are diverse learning styles within the ELL populace is one of the most important things an instructor can know. Not only do teachers need to consider the individual variances noted above, but it is also imperative that as ESL teachers we become knowledgeable of the influences that cultures have on how students interact in an educational setting. Personal independence, for example, is a salient characteristic of the American culture, and American students are therefore taught to be independent. In fact, ESL teachers will notice that their American students are noticeably more independent than children from some other cultures. This will become obvious to you when, for example, you give your students a choice. Let's say your directions to your elementary school students are: go to the crayon box, choose some crayons, get a piece of paper from the bin, and draw a picture of your favorite place to play. Students from cultures that do not value independence will check the next step with the teacher after each task, and they'll have trouble deciding what to do. You're going to hear, "What color should I pick?" This might be an indirect attempt to learn something personal about you. What's your favorite color, teacher? Some kids might say, "What do I do next?" Maybe all this means is pay attention to me, or do you like me? What should I draw? Ditto, an attempt to get your attention. Teacher, can you draw a treehouse for me? Again, going back to learn something personal about you. These questions don't mean that the ELL is incompetent or does not understand. Nor does it mean that they cannot follow directions or are cognitively unable to do the task. All it means is that they want to converse with the teacher, and they want to develop a friendly social relationship with the teacher. They're almost an imitation of the parent-child relationship. Teacher responses like, "I don't know," or "Well, what did I say?" will leave the ELL with the impression that you are a cold teacher. All of that has to do with the last two learning styles that are on this list. These are the two learning styles that are culturally triggered: field independence and field dependence. Field independence is the European American approach to education. European American students as a whole are field independent learners. This means that white American students, field independent learners, tend to be motivated by impersonal, analytical activities that do not necessitate a group type approach. White American students typically like competition and individual recognition. They show a rational intrinsic appeal for the task without consulting others, and they do best with learning the history or theory of the activity before attempting to do the assignment. The field-independent approach to education will not be compatible with non-mainstream minority students, and teachers may assume students are less competent than they really are. Cultural bias may occur, and it may even appear that the minority student is in need of special education or has a behavioral disorder. Field dependence is also known as field sensitive. This is the approach to education preferred by African Americans, Arab Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and many Asian Americans, as well as ESL students, immigrants. United States schools typically ask the learner to articulate perceptions. It does not ask the learner to pay much attention to social cues. In other words, learning is impersonal. On the other hand, field-dependent or field-sensitive learners like to work with others to achieve a common goal, while very often interacting with the teacher. Field-dependent learners are greatly influenced by the teacher. They are more sensitive to others' feelings, opinions, and ideas. They enjoy assisting one another in a group effort, and they like to practice and learn by experimentation as opposed to conceptual discussion before starting the task. Teachers should develop integrated thematic units to help all ELLs comprehend the input that they are getting. Thematic units are sets of learning activities which allow students to explore many dimensions of a single topic using all 4 language skills and a variety of subject matter areas. For example, if you wanted the class to establish an aquarium in your classroom so they could study an underwater environment as their science component, you could bring in math and language arts and social studies as well. This could become a thematic unit. The students could be responsible for writing a budget for purchasing the aquarium equipment. The students could be responsible for writing thank you notes for class donations to set up the aquarium. That would be your language arts. And for social studies, you can have them study sailing legends, sailor songs, anything that brings culture into an underwater environment. Sometimes adapting the material for ELLs is as simple as thinking about the seating arrangement. Seat ESL students where they will have the most access to instruction and where their visibility will serve as a constant reminder to you, the teacher, to adapt your discourse or your speech. Vary the way students are grouped as well as the ways they are asked to participate and interact within those groupings. What Krashen refers to as the affective filter will be lowered if you do this. Here are some examples of how you can create small groups. You can have a mixed group, and there are 2 ways of creating that. The first way to create it is that you'll have 1 native English speaker and 2 English language learners. This is good because it increases the awareness of the problems that ELLs go through. For the native speaker, he'll really benefit from that. The other option for a mixed group is that you put new ELLs together with bilingual students. So 2 new guys and 2 bilinguals. So this is nice because having somebody who's like you, who is now bilingual, will help to continually validate your native culture. And it also validates the foreign culture that you're trying to adapt to. They provide support in ways that a native speaker would not be able to. So this is a good productive group. Other ways of grouping students, you can have a monolingual group. That means that they all speak the same language in that group. So you put all of the Haitians together in one group. You put all of the Mexicans together in one group. You put all the Russians together in another group. This is nice because it provides a comfortable environment for sharing ideas. You're with people who are like you, and so it makes it easier to say what you need to say. We do have to be careful of how much they're using their L1. We shouldn't forbid it because people are at various proficiency levels, but you want to monitor that. Another way of grouping kids is using the buddy system, where you have a new ELL and a buddy. So this is a pair instead of a small group. The buddy helps the newcomer acclimate, and he might help to reduce culture shock. Gender-based groups are really interesting for ESL. So you'd have all the girls together and all the boys together, regardless of what their L2 ability is. This is interesting because there are going to be some people, especially students from the Middle East, where interacting with males and females together is not tolerated. So this helps students to be active in class without having to worry about making those adjustments that they may not be ready to adjust to yet. Grouping students according to interest, irregardless of their L2 ability, is helpful, and then grouping students according to personality types. So you group by how well students complement and work well with one another. Think, Pair, Share is particularly good with ELLs. Again, this is a pair, not a group of 3 or more. A Think, Pair, Share is you think of an answer by yourself, you pair up with one other person to express your idea, to revise it, to practice it, and then you share it with the entire class. This technique allows ELLs to feel more comfortable. It lowers their affective filter. And by the way, when you're making all of these groups, don't forget to move the furniture around. You can move it into a U shape, squares, rows, whatever is appropriate for what you are doing that learning period. Adapting the classroom environment could also lower a student's affective filter. You can make the environment language rich. If you use centers, clearly mark off those areas and post the rules for that week's center activities using full print and rebus writing. Rebus writing means that you've got some words and some pictures. Pictures appear in the place of keywords in the text so that students can figure out and read things that they're not ready to read the words for. Another thing you can do is fill the room with realia and authentic reading and writing materials, even if you think it's over their heads. Get lots of realia, medicine containers, food containers, message pads, order forms. Make the environment student-owned. Incorporate items brought in by students. Display student work. Hang bulletin boards at their eye level, not yours. Why? You don't need to see it. You're the teacher. They need to see it. You can bend over. We don't want to put it so high that they can't even see it. You can have a mailbox or a bulletin board for their exclusive use or for their social use. Use books and other authentic print in students' native languages. Another thing that you can do is delegate. Turn over the classroom routines. Have them take roll by signing in on an attendance chart. Have restroom passes, lunch procedures, fundraising, all of that can be done by students to a certain degree. Develop a sense of community in the classroom. Classroom communities are places where every class member encourages and supports the learning efforts of every other class member, and where individual class members have a responsibility for the community's work and success. Talk about what it means to be part of a community. Develop a slogan. Record the history of your class. Develop rules and responsibilities for those members. Now you know what to do in your classroom. What you learned today will be applied in your TESOL methods class. In that class, you'll have to spend 20 hours in the public school system, partly spent teaching ELLs. Use these ideas to make input comprehensible in those lesson plans and in the lesson plans you teach after you graduate.